President Trump spoke to the world today, and for anybody wondering whether he would borrow from recent tweets, make dire threats to North Korea, echo some of the name calling the campaign, or restate the America First platform he campaigned and won on, you can rest easy, that's what he did. Today, making his first speech to the UN General Assembly, he did all that to the point it left some delegates taken aback and caused emotional reaction in the chamber, apparently, as a senior UN official put it to our Jim Sciutto. Here's a small sample.
If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
Well, the president also put Iran on notice, calling the multilateral nuclear deal the U.S. is a party to, quote, an embarrassment to the United States. He said some nations were, in his words, going to hell. The speech set off a wave of reaction across the political spectrum. From the left, The Atlantic's Peter Beinart writes it turned President Obama's foreign policy vision on its head. On the right, the National Review's Rich Lowry opened his piece with this, quote, as someone said on Twitter, never before has been there so much murmuring of holy expletive in so many different languages. With that in mind, I want to get New York Times' columnist Tom Friedman. What you made of the president's speech today?
Well, yeah, it's a worldview that I just don't share, Anderson. The worldview that the president articulated is America first. And I think we became a prosperous and secure country ever since World War II in particular by being America the most connected. And I think in a world where networks are basically becoming the center of our lives and what flows through that network, ideas, trade, opportunity. The country that's most connected to the most networks is the country that's going to be the most thriving and the most secure. And I just don't agree with the president's point of view. I also think the speech was larded with contradictions. Others have pointed this out. You know, the president says now, you know, the first thing is sovereignty. Countries have to respect each other's sovereignty. And one really is tempted to ask President Trump, really? We had the biggest nonviolent attack on our sovereignty by Russia during the last election, according to our three leading intelligence agencies, that our country's ever experienced, and he is yet to really condemn that. And the other contradiction is he basically signaled that he wants to rip up the Iran deal and apparently intends to do so, the Iran nuclear deal, one that has denuclearizes Iran effectively, prevents it from getting a nuclear weapon for 15 years essentially. And at the same time, we're going to persuade North Korea to voluntarily give up its nuclear weapons. If you're sitting in North Korea and you see that the United States struck a deal with Iran, Iran gave up its nuclear option, and now the United States wants to tear that up, that's not going to really work in great harmony with your North Korea diplomacy. So that's my general reaction.
This notion of America first, and I mean, you know, it's something, it sort of echoes something else he said during the campaign about kind of not dictating to other countries, or not sort of being certainly the world's policeman, but also not sort of trying to change or nation build in other countries. Is that something which, do you think he actually believes that? Because, I mean, obviously there are many countries where the U.S. is involved with and is trying to dictate terms on how they should behave and what they should do.
Yeah, it's just not particularly thought out. Obviously, we're telling the Iranians how to behave, but we're not telling the Saudis how to behave. And, you know, both of them have problematic domestic issues as far as we're concerned, and even international ones. So none of it, Anderson, feels deeply thought out to me. It starts with a kind of you know, catchphrase, America first, and then it attempts to build a kind of global foreign policy around it. It doesn't strike me as very deep, and it flies in the face of how we built a world that has been largely peaceful, if one looks at the broad span of world history, and made us largely prosperous ever since World War II. It argues that there is a completely different approach. So what do you think are the odds that every one of our statesmen, our greatest statesmen since World War II, who built American prosperity and security on the idea of making a much more inclusive world shaped around our values and really our interests, that they got it all wrong, but Donald Trump and Breitbart got it right?
You know, there are some supporters of Trump who will listen to what he said about North Korea and say, well, look, you know, maybe this kind of threat it will work. I mean, nothing else seems to have worked, they would point out, through multiple administrations which have tried kind of different tactics on this.
Well, I want to take up that specific point because I think there they have a point. I don't, Rocket Man is kind of juvenile, but whatever. Maybe behind it is a feeling that we need to shrink this guy, in North Korea, not build him up. So, put a nickname on him, and making him afraid of what Trump may or may not do. I don't have a problem with that. The real question is there a long-term strategy other than living with North Korea with a nuclear bomb? Are we really ready to go to war over that? I just don't know. I sense so, Anderson, in what the president said, what I've heard Mattis say in the last 24 hours, we may be approaching a point where we will say to the North Koreans, the next rocket you test, the next ballistic missile you test near one of our allies, particularly China and South Korea, we are going to take out the launcher. And then you put the North Koreans in a situation where they have to decide if they retaliate by taking out the launcher, they are beginning a process that could end up indeed in their own suicide. The one thing that has made me, slightly, somewhat hopeful that this doesn't have to come to a violent solution in the Korean Peninsula is the fact that North Korea is a three-generation dynasty. It's now been ruled by 3 generations of the same family. That suggests to me that this family is not suicidal, it's homicidal. And I do believe that gives us some room for maneuver. I wouldn't bet the wife and kids on it, but it does suggest that at the end of the day, these guys aren't in the business of committing suicide.
Tom Friedman, thank you very much. Tonight, another CNN exclusive in the Russia investigation. CNN has learned that the special counsel investigation into Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, is examining activities that go back more than a decade. Our Evan Perez and Shimon Prokupez and Pamela Brown, they're breaking the story tonight, and Pam Brown joins us now. So what have you learned?
Well, Anderson, Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigators are reaching back to 2006 in a probe that centers on possible tax and financial crimes involving Paul Manafort. It's one indication, Anderson, of the pressure that Mueller's team is now placing on the former Trump campaign chairman. And the broad time frame shows that Mueller's team is going well beyond Russian meddling during the campaign as part of the investigation of Trump campaign associates. And as we reported yesterday on your show, Anderson, Manafort has been the subject of an FBI investigation for years, including wiretaps, and he has emerged as a focal point for Mueller. In fact, it's been one of the most visible investigations in under Mueller's direction. Manafort's spokesman declined to comment for this story, but Manafort has denied any financial wrongdoing, Anderson.
It's also interesting. Why are they looking as far back as 2006?
Right, because this is a period mentioned in the search warrant. As you'll recall, there was the raid back in July of his home in Virginia. It covers much of the decade that Manafort worked as a consultant for Ukraine's former ruling party. It's that work, Anderson, that prompted the FBI's interest in Manafort initially. That party was accused of corruption, and the FBI was trying to figure out whether the American consultants were involved.
I understand you also have new details about the July raid on Paul Manafort's home in Virginia.
We do. So we have learned that the search was an unusually hard-nosed. It was a no-knock warrant, as we previously reported, and sources tell us it began well before dawn as Manafort and his wife lay in bed. FBI agents entered with guns drawn. They insisted on searching Kathleen Manafort for weapons. That's his wife. A standard part of FBI searches is asking to search for weapons, but it was something that was certainly jarring to the Manaforts, we're told.
There's obviously been a lot of focus on Manafort in this investigation. What can you tell us about whether he's going to be charged?
Well, that is the big question, and we are told that Mueller's team has warned Manafort that they are working to charge him with possible tax and financial crimes. So that's an indication that this investigation could be in an advanced stage, and we should note that none of that is about election meddling. It's really focused on tax fraud, possible financial crimes. Again, nothing has happened yet, but this is what they've been investigating, and it does seem to be in an advanced stage. Mueller's office has subpoenaed reams of financial records from Manafort, in addition to the documents agents seized during that search back in July. And we also know that his spokesman testified to a grand jury last week, Anderson.
All right, Pamela, great reporting. Thank you. A lot to talk about with the panel. Joining me tonight, Kirsten Powers, Scott Jennings, Paul Begala, Tara Setmayer, and Jeffrey Toobin. Jeff, what do you make of this? I mean, hard-nosed search and the fact that it goes back all the way to 2006.
Well, I've rarely seen a prosecutor focus on someone trying to flip them as hard as Mueller is trying to flip
bottom
Manafort.
line, that's what they're trying to do.
I mean, I just can't imagine any other explanation for what's going on here. There have been recent changes in white-collar crime law that expand the statute of limitations to 10 years or even longer for many white-collar crimes. This happened actually after the Enron story broke a decade ago. So there is no doubt that Mueller has the legal possibility of filing these cases. Whether they are actually related to his jurisdiction, you know, we can't know. Presumably he is trying to establish some sort of motive for why Manafort is trying to ingratiate himself and perhaps the Trump campaign with Russia because he has these long-term ties and financial ties to Russia.
Is it a reach? Is it, Scott, I mean, do you think
Well, I think that he's trying to get him to flip and give somebody up in the Trump organization. I think if you're the Trump people tonight, you know, if you want to put a silver lining on it, they've clearly not gotten anything on Russian meddling yet. That was made clear by the reporting. On the other hand, they're trying to take a guy who's in his 60s and say, if you don't want to spend the rest of your natural life in prison, you're going to give us something on Russia meddling. And so that's the conversations we don't know that are probably taking place. We haven't talked about General Flynn tonight, but I suspect they're trying to do the same thing to him. And so I'm worried about this investigation because if it leads to indictments between now and the midterms and they're somehow able to connect it to the Trump organization, that could have far-reaching political implications for the Republicans in the midterms, and obviously it would grind the administration to a halt, which is a terrible outcome for, you know, Republicans who want to see the president succeed.
Paul?
Yeah, this is the beginning, not the end. I think these are remarkable tactics. This is a remarkable situation. We've never before had at least allegations of foreign influence meddling in an American election. And so I think Mr. Mueller is going to be as thorough as his reputation suggests that he would be. And I think Mr. Manafort's in a lot of trouble. And I'm sure he's got competent counsel, but he better cooperate.
As someone who lived through investigations in the White House that you were in the Clinton administration, what kind of an impact does even a story like this have on folks who are in the White House, who are maybe going to be called to testify or who are kind of looking over their shoulders?
Right. And when I was in the White House, people who were called were only potential witnesses, right? This was just about whether President Clinton had an affair, whether he lied about the affair. So nobody else had the affair, nobody else lied about the affair. So nobody else was really in peril. And yet, it was enormously, I never got called, so I can't complain. But I had a lot of friends who were. They were hauled in front of the grand jury. They had hundreds of thousands of legal bills, some of them. In this case, Mr. Manafort may well have done something wrong. He may not have, but he's clearly a target in a way that nobody else in the Starr investigation was, except Bill Clinton. And he's not the only one. You mentioned General Flynn. There's been reports about other folks who've been called in. So this is going to be a colossal problem. But the folks who I feel more for are those who are peripheral. The people who helped the president draft the statement that was so misleading about his son-in-law and Mr. Manafort's meeting with the Russians. There's reporting that they're getting called in, that they're going to have to run up big legal bills. They're just staffers trying to do their job. But if in fact they made a mistake, if they even committed a crime, they're going to go down in this thing too.
That's why the Ethics Office has allowed anonymous donors for legal defense funds for staffers in the White House to be permissible now. This is a mess. No White House, and you know this, it has a chilling effect on the staff in the White House because no one knows who's next, what's going to happen. The last thing you want to do is be dragged before a special prosecutor. That is, you know, that's awful. Maybe the IRS is the only other place that might be worse. But this situation with Paul Manafort is quite serious, and it's detailed. Anyone who's been following this or following Manafort's career knows that he's been involved in some questionable business activity all the way back to way before he had anything to do with Donald Trump. Back when he was with Roger Stone and their lobbying firm and a lot of the foreign work that they did, which is probably why Mueller's going back that far. Let's not forget.
Let's be fair to. I'm sorry, I didn't mean.
Yeah, no, I was going to say let's not forget that the story that came out about Manafort's name being written down in the logs in the Ukraine when they raided those offices when things were falling apart there with potential cash payments in the millions of dollars to Manafort. These are all things that connect in a very indirect way to the association
Jeff,
with Russia and Trump and that influence, which is why Manafort's such a a target.
Right, but no one has ever charged him with any sort of crime before. So I think it's important to point that out, and no one will. And just the fact that that Mueller is leaning on him to cooperate against other people doesn't mean he has something to give on other people. Remember, Brother Begala will certainly remember Susan McDougal, who Ken Starr locked up for months in an effort to get her to cooperate against Bill Clinton. And she wouldn't talk because she said she had nothing to give. So maybe Paul Manafort has
Kirsten,
nothing
if
to
you're
give.
the White House and you're hearing that they're going back to 2006 with Paul Manafort, I would assume that would send fear into anybody of, well, wait, how far they're going to go back in other people's records and what might they find?
Yeah, well, I think it just shows the seriousness of it, right? That how extensive this is going to be, and but I do think we ultimately, I mean, Jeffrey's right. I mean, we don't really know that much, and we don't know if he knows anything. This all, this all presumes that there's something knowable, because obviously his financial and tax crimes would be bad if they happened. But what's more important is whether they were colluding with Russia in terms of, affecting the U.S. election. And so there's a lot of dots that have to still be connected here.